listening to that. In our fellowship, I love to get to know our brethren and your story. Tell me about yourself and your upbringing and your experiences and how you heard the truth. And we're a peculiar people, certainly, but we're a fascinating, eclectic group. And what does the term ecclesia mean for church? What does it mean? Called out. You and I have been called out and away from the world and its spirit. And that's a goodly portion of our lesson, our intent in our lesson this afternoon, brethren. And I'm going to say this up front, and it'll become somewhat self-evident as our lesson develops. Please hear what I have to say in the spirit that it's intended. I do not like, and I don't really intend to do this, I don't like telling people what they should do or how they should think. I prefer to encourage each individual to help inspire them to be the best Christian they can be and to make their own decisions and make their own judgments, and they don't have to think or see things the way I think or see things. So in that spirit, brethren, that'll become somewhat self-evident as this lesson develops. In 2 Peter, the 3rd chapter, verses that you are very well familiar of, Peter prophesying of the world to come and talks about the world that was, the present evil world, and the new heavens and the new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness that we look forward to. Peter says in 2 Peter 3:10 that the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. What does that mean? It's going to come kind of stealthily. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I had a little twist in my tongue as I said that, stealthily. However, he says, it comes in this quiet manner, but he says, in the which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, a profound noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. And so the heavens with great noise and the elements of the heavens, and they shall be destroyed with a great passionate heat. And then the earth and the works, the heavens and its elements. And it's a fascinating concept, what's meant by elements, brethren. It means things set in order. And an example of that is the alphabet. So the elements, the component parts of the spiritual nominal heavens, from A to Z, they're going to be destroyed. That's what it's talking about when it's speaking about the elements of the heavens. And the earth and the works therein shall be just quietly fizzle away? Not quite. It says they are going to be burned up. The Greek word there means totally consumed. Nothing that is as it is today is going to remain for the kingdom. Oh, I'm sure there's still going to be roads, and I'm sure there's still going to be leftover remnants of this present evil world that will be gradually replaced. And I have a particular, I don't mean to offend anyone here, I can't imagine what the work of demolishing New York City is going to be like. But I just have a vision of everything there eventually coming down and being replaced with such beautiful pastures and you know, a more civilized environment. I don't know. I don't mean to pick on New York, because I'm sure Portland will have the same thing. But he says, seeing that all these things shall be destroyed, he asks a question of his readers 2,000 years ago. The people in his own time, he says, seeing that all of this is going to be destroyed, what kind of people should you be? What kind of people should you be, he says, in all holy, my King James says conversation. It means behavior, or in godliness, and the word is piety. It means worship of God. It's not godliness being like God, but it's the worship of God. So in your behavior and in your love, your passion for God, how should you be, seeing all of this is going to go away? You have such great attachment to the world as it is now. You make your living here. You're a fisherman. You do this, you do that. All of this is going to go away. So don't be too attached to it, is what he's saying. And if he could say this to our Christian brethren 2,000 years ago, how much more true is it for you and I living today who are in the middle of it? The other day I was thinking of that first line of Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. I don't think we're quite there yet. Tom's nodding. You remember what it says, Tom? These were the best of times and the worst of times. Those are coming upon us very quickly, brethren. I truly believe. And that's part of the impetus for the consideration of this lesson as we develop it. And I do want to mention here that he says in verse 13, we're looking for these new heavens and new earth wherein dwells righteousness, in contrast to this present evil world, the iniquity the worldliness that we find around us. Wherefore, beloved, seeing that you look for such things, be diligent. And this means give your energy to that you may be found in him in three things. That you may be found in him in peace, in without spot and blameless. And file this away, because we're going to come back to this in just a moment. He wants you to be found in peace. And I think this means both personally, internally, and within the scope of our fellowship as an ecclesia, as a group of brethren, that we would be in peace, united in peace. Now, I had a marker in here somewhere. Here we go. In Luke, the 21st chapter, we have our Lord's great prophecy, and we'll excerpt a few lines from what Jesus told us to expect with regard to the time which I think is readily coming upon us, and I think a portion of this is already with us. He says in chapter 21, Luke 21, verse 26, that there's going to come a time when the King James says, men's hearts will fail them for what? Fear, looking on those things that are to come. It's interesting, and I don't think it's really wrong, but that's not what the original Greek says. The word heart isn't even in there. The idea is that men will be fainting because of fear. And have you ever had, and I'm speaking because this happened to me once, have you ever had an experience where you had such a traumatic experience that you fainted? That's the dramatic picture that he's trying to illustrate here, that you have such an understanding of the catastrophe that is looming in society, it just takes all your strength away from you. Many years ago, one of my best friends that I grew up with, one of the just nicest people I've ever met in my life, his name was Ken, did something really stupid and foolish. He fell out of a tree in a drunken stupor, broke his neck, and was paralyzed, and years later died from all the associating things from his paralysis. And when I went to see Ken in the hospital, they had him in this great big halo with screws bolted into the side of his head with counterweights coming down. And I went there to support my friend Ken, who I love. Ken and I we grew up, we're next door neighbors. And you've heard the old expression of heart of gold. This guy, Ken, had a heart of gold. In the kingdom, I can't wait to see Ken, because Ken is going to skedaddle up the highway of holiness, if skedaddling is what they do. But he was just such a good-hearted person. I walked into that hospital room and saw him there with these bolts in, and I walked in, and I don't know what to say. I just keeled over. I fell flat in my face on the floor. I fainted. I've never fainted in my life. I don't want to get too far off track here, brethren. I get talking and I ramble. But when I see Ken in the kingdom, I'm going to cry like a baby. So I think of the blessings of the kingdom, and sometimes when I think of billions and billions and billions of people, it doesn't resonate for me. I just can't wrap my brain around that. But I think of my buddy Ken, and I think of him coming back, and that makes the kingdom so real to me. If I could step in front of a train and speed it up, oh, please, I'd be so happy to do that. So there's going to be, and we have this existing today, brethren, men's hearts, those people in the world who look beyond just their daily lives. And, we know the picture of Noah. The people were ignorant of what was coming their way. But I think many people today in our society, I think you don't have to be that perceptive, really. But the very perceptive ones, I think they're in more pain than others, because I think they see the collective elements coming together for the collapse of this society. And I think they're terrified by it. And I think the terror is causing a reaction. And I think, brethren, I'm going to touch on, and this is why I'm asking for your indulgence, the political climate in our country today and the political climate around the world. I think that people are terrified of what may happen and are willing to do a lot of things that otherwise they wouldn't do to try and stave off the inevitable. And I know I'm terrible on time, so I'm going to throw a couple of points out. I have been reading recently works of Will and Ariel Durant. Are you familiar with them? The Story of Civilization. And I promise you, I haven't read all 20 volumes, but I've read excerpts from goodly portions, The Age of Faith, etc. But Will Durant has a small tome called The Lessons of History. And in there he talks about the rise and the fall of varying civilizations. And he makes some profound and prescient views of past civilizations that are very timely in what we're seeing today. And a couple of citations just as we go forward here. He has said in the Lessons from History that civilizations usually begin with order, and the order grows, and then it grows with liberty, and then it dies with chaos. And he said, when liberty destroys order, the hunger for order will destroy liberty. I personally, brethren, am of the ilk that I think this old order is not going to go out quietly. I do believe in a cataclysmic end to this age. And I think, brethren, it lays before us and it terrifies people. And part of the excerpt from Durant here is to suggest that as people become more and more aware that liberty is destroying society and chaos is ensuing, they're much more willing to put autocratic people in control to stamp down on any and all. And I do believe, as Brother Russell's suggestion, that before us, brethren, lies the potential for a church-state unity to try and keep the status quo. And I believe that's in front of us, brethren. men's hearts failing them for fear, looking after those things that are coming on the earth. Well, it says in the preceding verse that the people see earth with distress, which means held in a tight grip. There just seems to be, as it continues and says, distress of nations with perplexity, and you know that word means, for perplexity, the Greek word means no way out. So the world is perceived, and men see this, that they're in a vice grip, and there is no way out. And you know, in our world today, brethren, it doesn't really matter whether one administration's policies are in place or another administration's policies are in place, and what laws are passed or what comes from the rulings of the Supreme Court. It doesn't matter which path is taken, whether path A or path B, because the die is already cast. The old order will be destroyed. You may have individual preferences and you may have inclinations, whether you're conservative ilk or whether you're more liberal ilk, one way or another. However, brethren, it doesn't matter what legislation is passed, what paths are taken, whether this is supported or that's rejected, because it's all going to be burned up. That's what Peter said in 2 Peter, the 3rd chapter. Brethren, for you and I guess the summation of what I would like a takeaway from this lesson is, for us, I have a series of scriptures in my notes here, brethren, that I think tell you and I that we should touch lightly the things of this earth. And particularly when we're reading of the earth and the works thereof, if you scan some of these verses that I'm going to go through and look at the extended Bible comments, etc., and get the flavor of Brother Russell's approach on this, the simple takeaway from this lesson is, brethren, don't get involved in the world of today, and especially don't get involved in politics of today. You may have a conservative or a liberal ilk, but you know what? It is largely disruptive to the Christian, and it is very divisive. And I don't know how many of you have experienced this. We are facing, brethren, a presidential election coming up soon. And if you watch the news, in this day and age, Walter Cronkite isn't around anymore. It's not news. It's partisan commentary. And I'm not going to get into my own predilections on this, but I try and watch the news as carefully as I can and filter out all of the excesses in biases, etc., brethren, because I think it's just, I don't believe it's a bad thing to be as aware as possible what's going on in the world. You know, I think it's part of the theme behind the 4th volume is analyze all those newspaper articles Brother Russell cites. Analyze what's going on in terms of the preparation of the elements. Observe what's going on in Ukraine and Israel and Russia and around the world, and be well informed. But be informed, but don't be actively engaged in the cares and concerns of the world, brethren. So that is absolutely, I don't know what you've observed or what you've experienced, brethren, but I have seen brethren bringing politics up in meetings. And I get an absolute visceral reaction to that. It appalls me. I've heard brethren in fellowship going at it from one side to another side. And that appalls me beyond belief. And I've seen postings on social media of brethren supporting this party, that party, or another. That appalls me. I get an absolute visceral reaction. I am perfectly happy for you to have your views, but either keep them to yourselves or don't throw them out in a divisive fashion with someone else who sees things differently than you do, because all that's happening with that is divisiveness. And we've got this presidential election coming up. There's going to be so much nonsense in the news, so much vitriol, so much anger. And what is political dialogue and commentary in this day and age? It's mostly, do you know how bad those guys are? Do you know what they do? It's not for what we believe. It's against what the other guy believes. That seems to be the predominating flavor of political dialogue. It's not a civilized art form, if it ever was. Some say it was. I wouldn't know. I'm not that old. But brethren, take a look in your Bibles. And how am I doing on time? I go till 5 o'clock? Is that correct? Yeah, thank you. I'm getting I had a panic attack there for a moment after yesterday. I am doing my best, my very level best, not to look at my notes because I'll get lost. Hang on one sec here. If you have a moment, brethren, turn in your Bibles with me to the book of James. You have to love James. James doesn't mess around. James says things in a very abrupt, strong manner. And I love his words in James, the 3rd chapter, and I'm looking at verses 14 down to 18. James says, within the scope of our fellowship as Bible students, he says, if you have any bitterness and envy and strife in your hearts, do not glory and lie against the truth. The word for strife here is factions. And brethren, in large part, what he is warning you and I about is don't get into things that are divisive. Don't get into this mentality of factions, of, I support this conservative agenda, I support this liberal agenda. I don't think that's specifically what he's talking about, but my point is this is a principle that we can draw from this. Just don't get into things that cause factions and divisions in our fellowship, especially the spirit of the world, the spirit of politics, which is divisive and disruptive and does nothing to promote our love of God and Christian graces. He says, this kind of wisdom, divisive wisdom, is not from God. He says it is of the world, the flesh, and the devil. So where does a spirit of divisiveness come from? It doesn't come from the Father. He says in verse 16, where there is envying and strife, this spirit of divisiveness amongst you, he says there is confusion and every evil work. The Greek word for confusion here carries the thought of anarchy, of a failure to appreciate orderliness in our fellowship. I am sorry, brethren. However, he said, what is from God, he says in verse 17, is first pure. It is then peaceable, gentle, easily to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without any doubts, without hypocrisy. It is genuine. And then verse 18 says, the King James says, the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by them that make peace. In the Greek, it reads, the harvest of righteousness is sown in peace. Brethren, for you and I, as opposed to divisiveness, we need a climate of peace between us, a certain comfort zone where I feel comfortable with you, that we're not going to have some divisive conversation that's going to disrupt my spiritual or your spiritual, I'm looking for the right word, tranquility or peace. We need peace between us to develop this harvest of righteousness. Amid conflict, brethren, within our fellowship, that's not the climate in which we want to be able to develop as Christians. Now, I know I've got to move on. There's a whole series of scriptures that I have, brethren, that essentially talk about touching the world very lightly. Let's see. And let's see if I can just excerpt a few of these. I think I missed it. In Romans, the 12th chapter, verse 2, we are told not to be conformed to this world. We're not to be made in the pattern of the way things are done in the world. Yes, our clothing and our haircuts, we may look a little different now than we did in 1967. You remember the girls with the beehives and mini skirts and all of that kind of stuff? Yeah, we look like just regular people and we're fashioned accordingly, but not in our mentality. We don't do things as the world does things. And the world today is very antagonistic, very divided, partisanship, and that's part of what's going to destroy this country. One of the items that Will Durant said, and I found this rather fascinating, he said, when every civilization begins, it has within it the seeds of its own destruction. I thought, boy, that was an interesting statement. And then the statement was made with regard to America. Let me ask you a skill testing question, brethren. In the history of America, of all of the presidents that have existed, there's only been one president who didn't belong to a political party. Who was it? It was George Washington. George Washington served 2 terms, finished his term in 1897. Larry, I think that's right. And he, George Washington, when he left office, in his farewell address, it's worth reading, brethren. It's kind of like, oh my goodness, did he really say that? George Washington hated political parties. Absolutely, that was the thrust of his farewell address. He said, these 2 political parties who seem to do nothing but attack one another and try and destroy one another. This is George Washington, way back when. He said, this is going to be the downfall of this country. Well, it's taken a while, but I think he's getting, his theme is getting there. So the 2 parties at the time were what? The Federalists under Hamilton and Adams, and the, what did they call themselves? The Democratic Republicans, and they were known as the anti-Federalists. The Federalists, Hamilton and Adams, believed in strong centralized government, strong centralized financial and government control, and the leader of the Democratic Republicans, I stumble over that one, was, of course, Jefferson, thank you. And he believed in states' rights. So he said, these 2 parties are going to tear this country apart. And I frankly think it just took a little while for all of that to coalesce to the point that we're at today. Now, I just have a few minutes left, brethren. I promise I'm going to try and wrap up quickly. Our brethren, in terms of what the world is, if someone ever asks you, what's your political affiliation, you've got a couple of Bible verses by Paul in Philippians to cite to them. In Philippians, and we're just going to breeze through most of these, but in Philippians 3:15 to 21, Paul says, don't be part of this world. Don't let it influence you. He said, because the King James says our conversation and it's more correctly termed our citizenship is where? It's in heaven. The Greek word is politema, and it means our political affiliation. If you've got a political affiliation, brethren, it's in heaven. So let's take a look at 2 Timothy, the 2nd chapter. And I always used to forget where this was when I was looking for this. And then I did a little mind whatever trick on myself, and it's helped me remember. I think of, this is not a parable, but I think of this as this helps me. I think of this as the parable of the soldier, the athlete, and the farmer. And when I think of that, the lights flash on for me, and I kind of, oh yeah, that's Timothy, and I remember that. So in 2 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, Paul, talking to his beloved son Timothy, says, endure hardness as a good soldier of Christ, in verse 3. And he says, no soldier that warreth, and the Greek word means who's in active service. Brethren, you are in active service. He says, no soldier who's in active service entangles himself with the affairs of this. The King James says this life. The Greek word means everyday life. You just don't entangle yourself. Yes, you've got to work, and yes, you have mortgages and obligations in this world to take care of. That's just normal. But don't let yourself be entangled with the foolishness and the folly of the spirit of the world. And my particular emphasis this afternoon in this lesson is just stay out of politics. I wonder, where is Brother David Stein? Oh, David, excuse me, I'm not looking over here. We were on a panel together in, no. Yeah, I remember that. But this was in Albuquerque. And the theme was about the Christian connection to the world. And I think it was you that said, it was such a good idea, I'm attributing it to David. And he was saying, no, just don't get involved in politics. However, there are sometimes like local central things that, maybe you have a child that has special needs and you need some advocacy for the local school board or whoever to make sure that's taken care of. That's a whole different kettle of fish. So this is not an easy read on what to do and what not to do, but I think for me personally, brethren, it's an easy read. Don't get involved in the divisiveness of this upcoming presidential election. Don't allow it within the scope of your fellowship, because it will be divisive, it will be disruptive. Hold your views and embrace them. You believe what you believe. Otherwise, you would be a hypocrite, which is perfectly fine. We observe, but don't engage in this stuff. It's not healthy for the welfare and well-being of us as new creatures. So he says the soldier doesn't entangle himself with affairs of everyday life. And then he says of the athlete in verse 5, if a man would strive for the mastery in competing in athletics, you have to do it according to the rules. The Lord has told us time and time again, brethren, and I don't have time to cover all of this, but I have a whole series of reprint articles by Brother Russell and his take on this. Just don't get involved. Yes, John the Baptist may have criticized Herod over the relationship with Herodias. Have you ever read what Brother Russell says about that? What does he say? He says John blew it. John should not have done that. And he says it's not our place to look for sin in the world and start condemning it. He goes on in his comments and said, that's coming from the Lord in his appropriate time and in his appropriate way. It's not for us to do it. And then with regard to Jesus censoring the scribes and Pharisees, John censored the civic leaders. Jesus went after the religious leaders. You have to remember that that doesn't apply to us in this sense. Those scribes and Pharisees were sitting, as Jesus said, in Moses' seat. The nation of Israel had a covenant relationship with God, and they were steering the people down the wrong path. There's a phrase for that, which doesn't come to mind right now. And I will wrap this up very quickly. So, brethren, we do not follow those examples. We may, in the future, be asked of the Lord to condemn the union of church and state, but I think at that time there won't be any confusion. The Lord will make it plain to us if indeed that is the direction that we're headed, and I do favor personally, brethren, that this age is going to end with a cataclysmic bang, and we're going to be involved in it. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, he says, when I come to you, my brethren in Corinth, he says, I don't want to know anything about you other than Christ and him crucified. Read Brother Russell's comments on this. Brother Russell says, don't go to your brethren and start, well, I'm ad-libbing here, but this is the essence of it. Just don't go there and say, okay, what do you think about the Republicans and the Democrats? That's peripheral. Stick to the gospel. The other items of involvement in this world and its politics are a distraction. And I've talked to Homer, and I'm going to pick on Homer here. I asked him about some social issues some time ago, and Homer said to me, no, that's just a distraction. And I've never forgotten conversation with Homer on that particular thing. So, brethren, don't allow yourselves to get involved in distractions. So that's and the last one on here that I didn't read yet from 2 Timothy 2, we've talked about the soldier, the athlete, and the last one is verse 6 is the farmer. He says, and this is, we'll just touch on it briefly because I mentioned it. The farmer that labors must be first partaker of the fruits. It's hard to figure out what he's saying, but in actual fact, I think what he's saying here, if you're involved in the harvest, you first need to have the fruitage of the knowledge, the fruit of the Spirit, and the fruitage of knowledge of the gospel to engage in the harvest work. I think that's the sense of what he's saying here. Okay, I need to wrap up. Brethren, let me flip through. Oh, this is such a good lesson. It's for another time. Think of the world that Jesus and the apostles lived in. They did not try and change society at that time. They didn't try and put a new patch on an old garment. Yes, Jesus censored the behavior, but no, he didn't try and change their social order because that wasn't the work of the day. Think of Philemon and Onesimus, the slave. And Paul sees him, the slave, Onesimus, sends him back no commentary on that, whether this slavery is so bad. It's just they lived in the world in which they lived. And I think Homer mentioned earlier today about Romans, the 13th chapter, the first several verses. And that is, you live in this world, be submissive, because you're not part of this world. When I first came into the truth, I used to hear this all the time. And then I remember looking for it and I couldn't find it. It's not a Bible verse, but it's a Bible principle. You're in the world, but not of the world. And that's, give it a number. That's Luke 32, verse 2 or something like that, which doesn't exist. So, brethren, let me find my... I did want to wrap this up. Brethren, the question was asked, what manner of people ought we to be? We should be people enjoying peace, a peaceful climate in our fellowship to nurture the greatest possible growth one for another. My largest interest is that you make your calling and election sure, and that I make my calling and election sure, and then that we can help this poor sin-sick world in all of their good efforts and all of their tragically foolish efforts to maneuver things and manipulate things for the sake of power, the sake of money. All of that will be done away with. How should we address ourselves in this world? I would like to close with 2 Peter and a couple of verses from 2 Peter, the first chapter. Peter says that exceeding great and precious promises are given to you and I, and that by these promises you might become partakers of the divine nature, escaping the corruption that is in the world. Don't get involved in the corruption in the world. Add all of these beautiful fruits of the Spirit to your character in development. And then verse 7, he says, and when you're adding one thing to another, he says, to godliness, which is piety, to the love of God. Add to your love of God, phileo, love of the brethren, and to the love of the brethren, agape. Love God, love the brethren, love the world. Because he says, if these things are in you and they superabound, they're not just dormant, you're actively engaged. He says, they will make you that you are neither empty or unfruitful in the epignosis, the experiential knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. But if you can't see these things, brethren, if you are not developing in them, you are not being drawn by the vision of the kingdom. You're thinking too much of your life in the context of the here and now. Your life is to be seen in the context of eternity. Don't shortchange yourself. Don't be blinded, brethren, that what you do now affects your eternity. And he says, you're blind. You cannot see afar off. You can't see the kingdom. You're not inspired by it. You've forgotten that you were purged from your old sins. Rather, brethren, give diligence to make sure your calling and election sure. And if you do these things, you will never fall. For so an entrance shall be ministered unto you abundantly into the everlasting kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. May the Lord add his blessing. Thank you.